He rode into town before the sun had finished climbing over the hills. Dust rising from his boots and coat like he carried the whole prairie behind him. Folks paused as he passed, not because they feared him, but because everyone knew the man who owned more cattle than any 3 ranches combined. He carried himself with the slow confidence of someone who wrestled storms and droughts and came out stronger every season. Yet that morning something in his eyes looked softer, as if a shadow followed him and refused to let go. He walked up the porch steps of the small clinic that had just opened beside the mercantile. A new sign hung above the door, painted in fresh white letters. He had seen it from across the street while tying his horse and felt a strange pull in his chest. Folks talked about the new doctor for weeks. Some said it was a man with city education. Others claimed it was someone from out east who wanted a clean start out west. He never cared much for rumors. But lately, he had been waking up with a pressure in his ribs, tight enough to steal his breath, and his foreman insisted he get checked. He hated clinics, hated being told what to do, hated the thought that even a strong rancher could have weakness in his bones. He pulled open the door, trying to look calm, though his jaw was set tighter than fence wire. The place smelled like herbs, pine soap, and something warm that reminded him of the past he worked hard to forget. He took a seat on the bench, eyes scanning the room. The walls were built from old logs but polished, giving the clinic a homely feeling rather than a cold one. A shelf held jars of dried plants, bandages, and small glass bottles with handwritten labels. A curtain hung in back where the exam table was kept. No nurse in sight, no voices either. Just quiet. He tapped his fingers on his knee, impatient. He wanted this over with. He didn't plan to stay in town longer than needed. There were cattle scattered across miles of grazing land, deals waiting to be signed, and a ranch full of hands counting on him. He came here to get a quick checkup, be told nothing was wrong, and ride home with his pride intact. But then footsteps sounded behind the curtain, slow ones, light. Once he lifted his head, the curtain pulled back, and his entire world shifted. Like a herd startled by thunder, there she stood. The woman he once planned to marry. The woman he had left behind. She wasn't the girl he remembered from summers past. She wore a white clinician's dress with rolled sleeves. Hair tied back neat, but still falling over her shoulders like soft copper fire. Her hands were steady, steady like someone who had held life and death between her palms. Her eyes widened when she first saw him, but she didn't step back. Instead, she lifted her chin, as if time had sharpened her rather than broken her. He stood slowly, heart hammering harder than during a stampede. He never thought he'd see her again, not after she disappeared the night before their engagement was supposed to be announced. He spent years burying the hurt beneath ranch work, cattle auctions, long nights on the prairie. He convinced himself she chose another life, another someone. That she walked away because she never wanted a rancher to begin with. She spoke first. Voice calm, though her fingers tightened slightly on the clipboard she held. Her tone wasn't cold, just guarded. "I didn't expect you to need a doctor." He swallowed hard, unsure if he should speak her name or pretend this was just another appointment. He chose the safe route and gave a small nod instead, shoulders tense. "Didn't expect you to be a doctor." There was a heartbeat of silence, the kind that pulled old memories to the surface. The way she used to meet him by the river at dusk. The way she once promised she'd follow him anywhere. The way she walked away without giving him a chance to fight for either of them. She stepped closer, only a few feet away now. He noticed faint tiredness beneath her eyes, the kind people carried when they'd fought their way through hardship. This wasn't the woman who ran from promises. This was someone who had rebuilt herself. "I studied for years," she said. "Passed through towns, camps, rail stops. Everywhere folks needed help. A small town like this needed someone full-time." He tried to look unbothered, but his voice came out rougher than he wished. "You left without a word." She lowered her gaze for a moment. Her hand brushed a bottle on the table, steadying herself before speaking. "I left because I had a reason. Not because I wanted to." He drew in a slow breath. Old wounds stirred. Every part of him wanted to demand answers, but he clenched his jaw. He didn't want to reopen the past while sitting on an exam table like some feverish ranch hand. She motioned toward the table. "Sit. Tell me what brought you here." He hesitated before moving to sit down, the leather cushion creaking beneath his weight. She checked his pulse, her fingertips lightly pressing against his wrist. The touch was professional, not intimate, yet his chest tightened anyway. Every small touch reminded him of nights beneath cotton sheets, whispering dreams neither of them ever lived. Her voice steadied. "How long have you been short of breath?" "A few weeks." "Comes and goes. Chest pain?" "Sometimes, mostly when driving cattle uphill or working too long." She nodded thoughtfully, then placed her stethoscope against his chest. Her hair brushed close to his shoulder. He sat stiffly, trying to ignore how close she was. The room suddenly felt warmer, too warm. Her brows furrowed slightly as she listened. Like something in his heartbeat wasn't quite right. "You've been working too hard," she said, "and it sounds like strain. But there's something else." He looked up sharply. "Something wrong?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped back, arms crossed loosely, eyes scanning him not like an ex-lover, but like a doctor searching for truth. "I need to ask a question," she said. He nodded. "Before I tell you anything, I have to know the truth. Why did you think I left?" His breath caught. He wasn't expecting that. Not here. Not now. He straightened, shoulders rising with defensiveness and old hurt. "I figured you got tired of ranch life," he said. "Tired of waiting. Found something better." She stared at him, eyes shining with pain and something deeper, like she had carried a story for years, with no place to set it down. "I never wanted to leave you," she whispered. "I left because I found out something that night." "Something about you?" He froze. His pulse pounded louder than her stethoscope had moments before. "What did you find out?" he asked. She closed her eyes briefly, gathering courage. When she opened them, her voice trembled just enough to shake his certainty. "You weren't the one hurting that night." "I was." He leaned forward, brows tightening. "What does that mean?" She took a slow breath, stepping closer, looking straight into his eyes with the truth he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. "I left because I found out something that would have changed both our lives forever. And now that you're here, I think it's time you finally know what it was." Her voice softened, but the weight behind it hit him harder than a winter storm. "If I tell you, nothing between us will stay the same." He stared at her, chest tight. Not from illness, but from the truth he had chased and avoided for years. "What did you find out?" he asked again, voice low. She held his gaze, lips trembling just slightly. "It wasn't my future I ran from. It was yours." And before he could ask another word, she turned away, reaching for a folder she kept. Locked in the cabinet, whatever was inside, it wasn't just history. It was the secret that tore them apart. And now it might tear open everything. He built, since he watched her unlock the small cabinet, the key trembling slightly between her fingers. He had seen her nervous before, back when they were young and dreaming of building a ranch house near the stream. But this was different. She carried a heaviness that felt older than both of them. The soft clink of metal against wood echoed through the quiet clinic. As she pulled out a slim folder tied with a piece of worn twine, she held it close for a breath, as if deciding whether she had the right to open the past again. He sat forward on the edge of the exam table, boots braced against the floorboards, heart beating faster despite trying to steady himself. He had come here to check his health, not reopen wounds or dig up secrets that time should have buried. Yet now, he couldn't imagine walking out without knowing what truth had driven her away. She set the folder down on the table between them, but didn't untie it. Instead, she moved to the window, looking out at the calm street beyond. Horses tied at hitching posts flicked their tails lazily. A wagon rolled by carrying hay bales. Folks called to each other across the dirt road. Life outside carried on like nothing inside this clinic could change the world. But he could feel a shift coming, like the moments before cattle bolt at the scent of lightning. "I didn't leave because I stopped loving you," she said, her voice low. "I left because something happened that night. Something I thought would ruin your future." He felt confusion twisting with frustration. My future was with you. That's what I wanted then. She nodded but didn't turn around. I know, but you were set to take over the ranch. Your father had just signed the last deed transferring the grazing rights. Everyone looked to you as the one who'd expand the cattle empire. You had plans, land, power. I couldn't hold you back. He pushed himself to his feet, the table groaning slightly. You never held me back. I wanted you there beside me. She finally turned, eyes bright with emotion she had pushed down too long. You don't understand. I found out something about myself that night. Something that would have chained you to a life you never asked for. His breath caught, his mind running through every possible explanation, none of them fitting. Illness, debt, family secret, none of those seemed enough to make her vanish without a word. What was it? He asked again, trying to soften his tone. Instead of answering, she moved closer, her voice more controlled now as she shifted into her role as a doctor. Before I tell you anything personal, I need to finish your medical check. If you're having trouble breathing, we need to examine everything properly. He wanted to refuse. He wanted answers first. But he also knew riding the plains short of breath could kill a rancher faster than any broken heart. He nodded, reluctantly. She motioned him to sit. She listened to his lungs again, pressing fingers along his ribs, checking for tenderness. When her hands brushed close to his skin, memory sparked, but she stayed composed. She asked questions about long nights driving cattle, storms he'd ridden through, times he'd ignored pain and kept working. He answered quietly, watching her face as she listened. You're carrying old injuries, she said, and you push yourself too hard. But your heartbeat isn't just from strain. It's reacting to stress, both physical and emotional. He frowned. You think this is all in my head? She shook her head. I think your body is warning you. Years of responsibility, losing people, pushing through every hardship without rest. That wears a person down. He looked away. She wasn't wrong. Since his father passed, he carried every burden alone. The ranch hands respected him, but they didn't understand what it meant to be responsible for so much land and so many families who lived off it. You're not invincible, she said softly. He didn't respond. He never liked being told he wasn't strong enough. Even when it came from someone who cared, she stepped back and finally untied the twine around the folder. The paper inside was fragile, yellowed around the edges. She opened it slowly, revealing a single handwritten note, folded twice. He recognized the handwriting. It was hers. His heartbeat stumbled. That night, she said, I went to speak with your father. I planned to tell him I was ready to stand beside you, take on the ranch life fully. I even brought a letter explaining how much I wanted our future. He remembered searching for her that night, finding only silence. But when I reached the porch, she continued, he was already waiting. He told me something he had kept from you for years. Her voice shook again, but she steadied it. He told me the land wasn't just meant to stay in your family. There was an agreement from long ago. A deal your father made with another ranching family. A pact that tied your inheritance to a marriage arrangement. His stomach dropped. What kind of arrangement? She held his gaze, regret filling her eyes. He said the ranch rights were meant to be passed through a union. Not to me. To someone from another family. His jaw tightened. He had heard stories of arranged agreements from settlers trying to expand land in cattle herds. But his father never mentioned anything like that. Not once. He told me if I stayed with you, she said, it would break the pact and leave you with nothing. No land, no cattle, no legacy. He felt like the room shrank. And you believed him? She looked down. I didn't want to risk destroying your life. I thought stepping away was the only way to protect your future. He backed up a step, struggling to breathe, though not from illness this time. You should have told me. I had a right to know. I know, she whispered. I thought I was doing the right thing back then. But I was young, scared. I didn't understand everything. He rubbed his forehead, pacing once. The truth left him torn between anger and understanding. He never imagined his father capable of forcing anyone's life through a deal. Yet the old man had always been more business than heart. Why come back now? He asked, why open a clinic here? She hesitated before answering. Because I learned something else later. Something that changes everything about that pact and who it really affects. He stared at her, pulse thundering again. What do you mean? She didn't answer. Instead, she closed the folder and pressed her hand over it, as if guarding a door not ready to open. There's more you don't know, she said quietly. Something your father never told you. And before you hear it, you need to understand everything about what happened after I left. He narrowed his eyes. What happened to you? She took a slow breath and leaned against the counter, the past weighing heavily on her shoulders. When I left, I traveled from camp to camp, treating workers, miners, settlers, anyone who needed help. But I carried something with me, a truth I learned that same night. It followed me through every mile of dust and every freezing morning. It changed the reason I studied medicine, stepped closer, trying to read her expression. What truth? She looked up, eyes shining with something more than pain, something like fear. I wasn't just running from the ranch. I was running from what I discovered about myself, something that connects to that pact, something that ties me to your family more than you know. He felt the air leave his lungs. What are you saying? She held the folder out toward him, but didn't let go. If you read this, she said, nothing in your life will stay the same. Not the ranch. Not your past. Not us. He stared at her hand on the folder, torn between wanting to grab it and wanting to walk out before the ground shifted beneath him, outside. The sound of distant thunder rolled across the open sky. Though not a cloud was visible, the storm wasn't on the horizon. It was already here. Sitting between them in a quiet clinic, waiting to break everything open, he reached out slowly, fingertips brushing the edge of the folder, but she held it firm. Her eyes met his, warning him that once he pulled it free, there would be no turning back. He hesitated, feeling the weight of years pressing down on him, then withdrew his hand before touching the twine again. Not here, he muttered. Not yet. She nodded, though he could see disappointment flicker across her face. She wanted him to know. Maybe she needed him to know. But he wasn't ready to let the ground crumble under his boots. Being a cattle baron meant one thing more than all the rest: control. And right now, control was slipping like rains in a storm. He stood, grabbing his hat from the chair beside the exam table. I need time to think, he said. About everything. Before she could answer, the clinic door swung open, and a gust of cold prairie wind rushed in with the town sheriff stepping inside. His boots clacked against the floor, and the star pinned to his vest glinted in the morning light. He carried tension in his shoulders like a man who'd rather be anywhere else. There you are, the sheriff said to the rancher. Been looking for you. There's trouble on your south pasture. Trouble was a word ranchers never took lightly. What kind of trouble? Your cattle, the sheriff said grimly. Some have been driven off. Tracks show skilled riders, not drifters. The rancher's jaw tightened. Cattle rustlers were bad enough. Skilled cattle thieves meant more than just stolen beef. It meant rivals. Someone with knowledge of his land. Someone who wanted to strike right at his pride. He shot a look toward the doctor. She stepped back, folding her arms, trying not to show worry creeping into her eyes. Their conversation would have to wait. Secrets could bleed into the dust later. Let's go, he told the sheriff. As he headed for the door, he paused and turned back toward her. She didn't move, didn't speak, just watched him like she feared she might never get the chance to finish what she started. The folder still lay between them like a scar that never healed. When I get this sorted, he promised, voice low, I'll come back for the truth. She gave a small nod that didn't hide how scared she was for him. Not scared of rustlers? Scared of what he would learn? He tipped his hat, then stepped outside. The door closing behind him with a thud that echoed like the end of an era. The sheriff swung onto his horse. He mounted his own and glanced back once. Through the clinic window, she stood silhouetted in the quiet room. A lone figure who had fled his world once was now tangled deep in its roots. He urged his horse forward. They rode hard toward the south pasture. Wind whipping past, dust rising beneath hooves. He tried to focus on the land, on the horizon. On anything that wasn't a red-haired doctor holding his future in a single folder. But her voice lingered. Her truth hovered like thunder, waiting to strike. By the time they reached the pasture fence, several ranch hands were gathered near the tracks. A few cattle lay dead, arrows sticking out of their hides. Others were simply gone. One of his hands approached, hat clutched to his chest. "Boss, we saw riders heading toward the ridge. Fast. Like they knew the land." He dismounted, kneeling beside one of the fallen cattle. The arrows were finely made, fletched with care, not rushed weapons. This wasn't wild raiders. This wasn't a random attack. Someone was sending a message. The sheriff crouched beside him. "Looks like the old land dispute is waking up." He stiffened. "What dispute?" The sheriff hesitated, like his words might cut. "Your father made enemies when he secured the grazing rights. Another family believed the land belonged to them. They've been quiet for years, since you took over. But with the new water trench you're digging, the fight over the south boundary might be lighting up again." He hadn't expected this. The land was his legally. But out west, laws didn't always rule. Sometimes pride and old grudges did. His gaze traced the ridgeline in the distance. The riders could still be out there, watching, planning. He stood tall, fists clenched. "Prepare the men. We'll search every canyon and trail if we have to." The sheriff placed a hand on his arm. "Easy. This isn't just cattle. There's history here. Blood history." That word made him think of the doctor back in town. Blood, lineage, secrets. It felt like every part of his life was turning. Upside down at once. He mounted up again. "History or not, no one steals from my land." As they rode deeper into his property, the sun climbed high, heat shimmering off the grass. He noticed more tracks, more signs of movement. Whoever these riders were, they weren't hiding their trail. That meant confidence. It meant they believed they had rightful claim. Hours passed. No sign of the rustlers. Just tension thick enough to choke. When he returned to the ranch house late in the afternoon, his foreman met him with more bad news. One of the wells had been poisoned. Not enough to kill. Just enough to send a message. He felt the pressure in his chest return, sharper this time. Not from sickness. Not from weakness. From fury, he stormed inside his house and slammed the door shut behind him. The ranch house, built strong by his father's hands, had always been a place of pride. But now the walls felt like they were closing in. He paced the floor, replaying every word the doctor had spoken. The pact, the arranged union. The land depending on marriage. Why would his father hide that? Why force her away instead of letting them stay together? What was he protecting? He poured water into a tin cup and took a slow sip, trying to settle his thoughts, but the cup trembled in his grip. He set it down quickly, not wanting anyone to see him shake. A knock sounded at the door. He opened it to find one of his ranch hands. "Boss, there's someone waiting for you in the yard." He stepped outside to see a young rider on a dark horse, dust coating his jacket. The rider held a rolled parchment sealed with wax. "This is for you," the rider said. "From the family on the ridge." He took the parchment and unraveled it. The message was simple, but cut sharper than a whip. The land returns to its rightful bloodline. Walk away while you can. Rightful bloodline. His. Stomach twisted as meaning slammed into him. The secret the doctor carried wasn't simply about the pact. It was about who truly owned the land, who truly belonged here. And if she was tied to that bloodline, then everything he believed about his future, his heritage, the ranch itself, might be wrong. The rider turned and galloped away without another word. He stood still, parchment fluttering in his hand, heart pounding harder than any cattle stampede he had ever faced. Behind him, the ranch spread wide and proud across the plains. But beneath the beauty, trouble grew. Outlaws riding his land. A forgotten deal. He's threatening everything. And a woman he once loved holding the key to the truth. He stared toward town, where her clinic windows reflected the last. light of evening. He didn't know whether he was riding back there to find answers or to lose everything he ever claimed to own. Either way, fate was waiting for him in that quiet little clinic, and she was waiting too. Night settled over the land like a heavy blanket. But he didn't head straight for the clinic. Instead, he rode out alone toward the ridge, needing space to think. The wind brushed through the tall grass, carrying distant sounds of cattle, wagons, and coyotes, each noise pulling at his nerves. His mind kept circling back to the message that rider brought. Rightful bloodline. It echoed louder than the thunder he heard the night before. He stopped at a rise overlooking the valley. From here, he could see the faint outline of his ranch house lanterns and the long stretch of land that defined his entire purpose. Everything he fought for, worked for, bled for, stood beneath him in silence. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing control over his own life. He had built his identity on land and cattle, believing he inherited his place through strength and hard work. But now, cracks opened in that foundation. He remembered her voice, soft but steady, telling him she left not because she wanted to, but because his future would have been torn apart. He realized now she carried truth heavier than heartbreak. She had been protecting him, even while shattering him. The thought made his chest tighten. He rubbed a hand across his sternum, hoping the ache was only from stress, not something deeper. A rustle behind him broke his thoughts. He turned quickly, hand near his holster, but a familiar ranch hand stepped into the moonlight, holding the reins of his own horse. Boss. You shouldn't be out here alone, the young man said. He exhaled slowly. Needed air. The ranch hand hesitated, then looked toward the ridge. Trouble's getting worse. Folks in town are talking. They say the family on the ridge is gathering men. Some say they're planning a full sweep of the south pasture by sunrise. Clenched his jaw. Let them talk. We'll be ready. The ranch hand nodded but didn't leave. Instead, he shifted nervously. There's more. The doctor sent word. Says she needs to see you again. Urgent. He didn't fail to notice the way the young man avoided looking him in the eye when saying it. Folks talked fast in small towns. Everyone likely knew something big was brewing. He mounted his horse again. You head back. I'll go to town. The ride back felt longer than the miles he crossed. Lanterns lined the streets by the time he arrived, and the town sheriff stood outside the saloon, talking to a small group of men who looked tense and ready for trouble. When the sheriff spotted him, he stepped away from the group and approached him quietly. You going to the clinic? He asked. Yes. The sheriff nodded. I figured. I'd stay careful. Folks are stirring up stories, connecting old land disputes to deeper things. Some think she came back with more than medicine. He narrowed his eyes. What are they accusing her of? The sheriff lowered his voice. Not accusing, wondering. When she left years ago, everyone assumed it was heartbreak. But now with the riders and the threats, some are. Dawn crept closer, carrying the distant thud of hooves from the far side of the ridge. And the valley waited to see which side of that promise would break first. The first light of morning slid across the valley, turning the creek into a ribbon of pale gold. The girl stood outside the lodge, watching the warrior tie his bowstring and fasten his blade. He moved with silent purpose, every motion practiced. She wanted to ask him not to go, wanted to tell him that facing those riders alone was too great a risk. But she knew the words would only weigh him down. So she simply touched his arm, hoping he understood everything she couldn't say out loud. He gave a small nod, not of farewell, but of promise, then disappeared into the trees with two other scouts trailing behind him. The camp felt different after he left. The quiet was heavier, as though the wind itself waited for something to break. Women continued their work, grinding corn and stitching hides, but their eyes kept drifting toward the northern ridge. Warriors moved through the camp with more urgency, checking arrows, whispering plans, preparing for what might come. Children were kept closer than usual, and the older men walked the perimeter of camp. Scanning the horizon again and again, the girl tried to help, but every task felt like moving through thick fog. She carried water, split small logs, and tended the fire. Yet her mind stayed on the warrior moving somewhere through hostile land. The older woman who had doubted her watched closely. She finally approached, handing the girl a woven shawl to cover her shoulders now that the air had cooled. The gesture was small, but it carried meaning. The girl thanked her quietly. The woman nodded, though her eyes still held caution. She said that when danger draws close, even strangers can become necessary. The girl understood. Gratitude and worry tangled together in her chest. Hours passed before a scout returned at full sprint. Breath sharp, face tight with urgency. The council gathered instantly. The girl stayed at the edge, listening. The scout reported that the riders had grown in number. Not 3 or 4 anymore, but closer to a dozen. Some wore coats that marked them as lawmen. Others carried rough expressions that hinted they were hired guns. They had set up camp near the narrow pass that led into the valley. They were waiting, watching, preparing, and among them was the merchant, pacing with restless anger. Pointing toward the valley with wild frustration, the girl felt her knees weaken. If they cut off the pass, the tribe could not travel freely, hunt, or move camp without being tracked or ambushed. The older men debated whether the riders truly intended to attack or simply threaten. The leader stood silent, absorbed in thought. When he finally spoke, his words were heavy. He said that conflict was no longer a possibility. It was approaching like thunder. Whether it came tomorrow or next week depended on small choices made now. The girl stepped forward, feeling the weight of her guilt press like stone. She told them she would leave if it would protect them. Her voice shook, but she meant it. She said she never wanted to bring danger to those who had offered her shelter when she had no one else. The older woman watched her with a softened gaze now, not suspicion but grim respect. The leader considered her offer but shook his head. He said that leaving would not stop what the riders wanted. The merchant needed a reason to seize land, to push the tribe aside, to take the valley for himself. If the girl left, he would simply find another excuse. Her heart sank. She felt trapped between 2 worlds turning against each other. That evening, the warrior returned. He carried dust on his skin and strain in his eyes, yet relief flickered through them when he saw her standing near the fire. The others gathered around him. He reported that the riders were preparing to advance at dawn. They were moving weapons into position, tying their horses higher on the ridge for a faster charge. The merchant had convinced the men that the tribe had hidden the stolen money and that capturing the girl would solve everything. Some men looked uncertain, others hungry for a fight. The lawmen tried to hold authority, but the hired guns carried more influence. The situation could break in any direction. The leader thanked him, then sent word through the camp to prepare for relocation at first light. They would move deeper into the mountains to avoid direct confrontation. But the warrior disagreed. He argued that abandoning the valley without a fight would not stop the riders. It would only signal weakness and invite pursuit. The leader countered that protecting the future meant avoiding battles that could destroy them. Their voices rose, yet both spoke from duty, not anger. The girl watched, torn between fear and admiration. Later, when the camp quieted, she walked with the warrior along the edge of the creek where moonlight rippled across the water. She asked what he truly believed should be done. He answered honestly. He said he wanted to face the riders head-on, not to kill, but to force the truth out before violence could spread. He said that if the merchant's lies took root, not only she, but his entire tribe would suffer in the long run. She told him she wanted to stand beside him, not hide. He turned to her, his expression shadowed with worry. He reminded her that danger would not spare her just because she chose to face it. She looked back at him, steady and determined. She said running had already cost her too much. Standing once, even in fear, might finally break the cycle that had chased her from one life into another. Something shifted in him then. He stepped closer, not with boldness, but with quiet certainty. The promise he made beside the fire echoed in the space between them. She felt warmth rise to her chest, not just hope, but a deep need to believe that the world still held people who could carry promises with honor. By the time dawn bled across the sky, the tribe was ready to move. Horses were saddled, lodges dismantled, supplies packed. But instead of joining them at the rear of the line, the warrior mounted his horse at the front, heading not away from the ridge, but toward it. Several younger warriors followed him. The girl moved to join as well, but the older woman stopped her with a hand on her arm. For a moment, she expected resistance, maybe even a demand that she stay behind. Instead, the woman wrapped the shawl more tightly around her shoulders and told her that if she chose to go, she must speak with courage, not fear. The girl nodded, then mounted a spare horse offered to her. The hooves kicked dirt as they rode toward the ridge where the riders waited. As they climbed, the air sharpened. The sun rose behind them, outlining the warriors against the sky. At the top, they halted. Below, the riders stood ready, guns visible, horses restless. The merchant sat tall on his saddle, a smug grin twisting his face when he spotted her. He shouted accusations, demanding she come down and surrender. He called the tribe thieves and accomplices. He promised the law would protect them if they handed her over. The sheriff rode forward, looking more conflicted than ever. His hand rested on his revolver, not in readiness to shoot, but in weary caution. He asked her to return, saying the town needed answers, that she was making things worse by hiding, before she could respond. A rifleman beside the merchant lifted his weapon, aiming at the warrior beside her. The wind held its breath. The girl pulled her reins tight, heart thundering. She could feel the moment stretching thin, ready to snap. Truth, lies, loyalty, fear, all of it suspended in that fragile space between voices and gunfire. The merchant's grin widened as the rifleman steadied his aim. The warrior stepped forward, unarmed, raising a hand not in challenge but in demand for silence. The girl felt the ground tilt beneath her, knowing that whatever happened next would decide not only her fate, but the fate of the valley. The tribe, and every promise made beneath firelight. The trigger tightened. The hilltop held its breath, and the world stood on the edge of breaking. The rifleman tightened his grip on the trigger. Eyes narrowed on the warrior who stood tall without raising a weapon. The wind tore through the grass on the ridge, carrying dust across the valley floor. Everything felt suspended, held in a single breath that refused to release. The girl felt her lungs ache, her hands trembling around the reins. She knew if that shot broke loose, it would not stop with one life. It would spark something far larger than any of them could control. Asking if she has ties to the other side of this land. If she's connected to the claim through blood. His grip tightened on the reins. The town always whispered. They didn't know the truth. They didn't know she carried secrets not for herself, but for him. "I don't care about gossip," he said sharply. "You should care a little," the sheriff replied. "Because if the other family finds out what she knows, they might come after her instead of you." He didn't answer. The sheriff tapped his hat and stepped away. The rancher guided his horse toward the clinic. Heart pounding, the clinic glowed softly inside, one window lantern flickering like someone had been waiting a long time. He tied his horse and stepped onto the porch, boots creaking against the wooden planks. He took a long breath before pushing the door open. She stood inside. Hands pressed on the table, eyes looking like she hadn't slept in days. The folder lay open now, papers spread out. She didn't speak until the door shut behind him. "You should have come sooner," she said, voice low, not angry, just shaken. "I got word from the ridge. They know something. They're closing in." He moved closer, removing his hat. "Tell me everything now. No more waiting." She gestured toward the papers. "These are records I found while traveling. Birth records, land deeds, letters, some written by your father, some from the family on the ridge. There was a promise made long before you were born, a promise that tied both families through blood. But here's the part no one knew." She slid one document toward him. He scanned it slowly, his breath catching when he reached the center. His name wasn't the only one listed under inheritance rights. Another name sat beneath it, handwritten faintly, as though someone tried to hide it but never erased it fully. He looked up sharply. "What is this?" She held his gaze without flinching. "You were not the only child your father had a claim to." He felt the ground tilt beneath him. "What do you mean?" "You had another connection. Through a woman your father knew before he married your mother, That connection ties you to the family on the ridge. His pulse pounded furiously. You're saying I belong to them? No, she said, stepping closer. You belong to both? That's why the land dispute is rising again. They don't know you're the bridge between the two sides, and your father died before telling you. If they knew, the fighting would stop. The land would be shared. The deal fulfilled. Shook his head. If that was the truth, why did my father push you away? She swallowed hard. Because the pact didn't just require shared blood. It required marriage between the families to seal the land rights. He wanted you to marry into the Ridge family, not me. He felt a cold weight settle in his chest. His father had tried shaping his life into a contract. And you? He asked quietly. She looked down. I found out I was tied to your family too. Not by name. Not by land. But through ancestry. If I stayed, it would break the pact because my bloodline pulled the claim in a different direction. I left to keep you from losing everything your father built. He stared at her, unable to speak. All the anger he carried for years began twisting into something else. Something heavier. Before he could respond, a window pane rattled. Hoofbeats thundered through the street. Both turned sharply as the sound grew louder. Torches glowed through the glass. He stepped to the door just as riders emerged from the darkness, lining up across the clinic yard. Their leader raised a torch high, casting sharp shadows across the street. We're here for the truth, the leader called out. And we're not leaving until someone answers for that land. His hand instinctively dropped to his sidearm, though he didn't reach for it. She stepped behind him, close enough that he felt her breath near his shoulder. You can't fight them, she whispered. He stood tall, eyes locked on the riders. I'm not running. The leader stepped forward, voice cutting through the night. Either you hand over the claim, or we take it by force. He opened the door wider and stepped onto the porch, the lantern behind him casting light across his face. You want answers? He said, voice steady. Then you're about to hear them. But you'll hear them from me, not through stolen cattle and poisoned wells. The riders shifted, uncertain. The air tightened, ready to snap. He looked back once at the doctor. She held the folder to her chest like it was a shield. The truth was no longer hiding, and the next step would decide whether the land united to histories or tore them apart forever.